morning. Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Baker Keffer, and I'm Vice President of The Atlantic. I wanted to start just with a few announcements, a couple schedule changes for today. First of all, at the 10:30 session, we've had 2 sessions switch rooms. Can We Make Government Work will now be here at the McNulty, and the race workshop will be at the Greenwald Pavilion. Noon, the luncheon with Michael Steele has changed. Michael Steele has canceled from the Aspen Ideas Festival. Sorry about that. There will be a political panel in place of that session, though, so same time, same location, and that will include David Brooks, Michael Gerson, and Mickey Edwards. So on to this session, and I can tell you, you are in for a treat. This is a plenary session with Richard Florida called The Great Reset. And not coincidentally, that is the name of his current book as well, The Great Reset. You might also know him for 2 other books he's published, Who's Your City, a very recent one, and in 2003, probably his best-known book, The Rise of the Creative Class. I hope that you'll also know Richard as a regular contributor to The Atlantic in our pages and on our website, theatlantic.com, and as a contributor to the Globe and Mail. Richard and his wife, Rana, live in Toronto, where Richard is director of the Martin Prosperity Institute and professor of business and creativity at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. Richard would be happy to take your questions at the end of this session, so we'll save some time for Q&A, and we'll have mics around the room, so please wait for a mic to come to you. He's also available to sign his book, so 10:10, right after this session, up at the Pepka tent, Richard will be doing book signings. So again, brace yourselves. This is going to be a great session with Richard Florida. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for that most kind introduction. And thank you to the Aspen Institute, the Ideas Festival, and the Atlantic, and thanks to all of you for coming out. I'll talk for a little bit, and then I'm absolutely interested in hearing all of your questions. And I will say, as an academic and a professor, I appreciate challenges and questions. I also learn much more from my critics than I do from my advocates, so don't feel you have to pull any punches. Fire away. I want to talk about the Great Reset, but I also want to talk about, and since I looked over the program, which just is absolutely amazing, I also want to talk about some of the ideas in my previous work, Rise of the Creative Class, and put those in some kind of context, and do all of that fairly quickly to save as much time as we can for questions. We are going through, this isn't your run-of-the-mill average business cycle fluctuation. I think increasingly each and every one of us recognizes this. When the folks at The Atlantic, Don Peck, my editor there, contacted me as the markets crashed and we began to talk about a piece that became a cover story, there was a sense that something significant was happening, but there were lots of folks who wanted to minimize its impact and create euphemisms for what we're going through. And I think the belief was that somehow through sophisticated use of monetary policy, with a little bit of fiscal policy and stimulus, we could sort of paper this thing over. When Paul Krugman writes that we are staring in the face of a third depression, you know, and that's not, you know, people who I'm also big fans of, Nouriel Roubini and others, you know that's serious business. So what I was able to do over the course of the past 9 months was go back and look at the 2 previous analogous events, the Great Depression of 1929 in the 1930s, and then the Panic and Long Depression of 1873, and also try to take a look at some trends and tendencies, emergent patterns in our current society that may augur in or may help us understand the kind of economic event we are going through and what it might take over the long haul to recover and engage a new age of prosperity. So that's what I want to talk about. In a nutshell, our economy has changed dramatically. My own hunch on this, and others may debate and argue, and that's always fun and interesting, my own hunch on this is this is the most dramatic and fundamental economic change in modern economic life. This is a big and fundamental transformation that lots of people have their arms around, but many others want to neglect or ignore. And that when there are big and fundamental economic transformations like the current one, they typically produce crises. Joseph Schumpeter wrote about that. People like Hyman Minsky wrote about that. Karl Marx taught us a lot about that. They typically produce very deep crises. Yes, there's all kinds of epiphenomenal reasons for that. The banks get involved in speculative lending. Developers take on too much risk. People take on too much debt. But the real underlying reason for crises and the only route to recovery is an understanding that we have not built the fundamental social, economic, and geographic underpinnings that are required for a new prosperity. We built a new kind of knowledge and idea-driven economy, and talk about that in a second, and we failed to put in place the fundamental economic institutions, social changes, and, in my view, geographic and spatial transformation that would allow us to prosper. So what happened? The money went flowing into speculative endeavor. It went back from clicks to bricks and mortar, to real estate. There was a huge run-up in housing prices and land inflation, and we got to the present moment. Why do I say this is a deep and fundamental economic transformation? That goes back to my work on Rise of the Creative Class. For all of human history, societies have developed wealth and prosperity primarily and principally through two mechanisms. For most of our time on Earth, we became prosperous because we inherited locations with abundant physical natural resources. We were on river deltas with fertile soil. We could hunt and gather and develop crops and become more efficient. We located around riverbeds and natural port facilities. And then, with the Industrial Revolution, we added a second and perhaps a third dimension. We figured out that by adding to natural resources, physical labor, and using capital to prime the pump, that we could radically improve our productivity and wealth. And economists have a simple formula. Those of you who are economists, who like to read economics, if you want to understand where economic growth comes from, the simple formula handed down from David Ricardo and others is land, labor, and capital. Well, for most of human history, those were the keys to wealth. I lived in Pittsburgh for nearly 20 years. In Pittsburgh, progress was measured simply man-hours per ton of steel produced. Those were the metrics that were equated with progress. But something happened over the past 3 or 4 or 5 decades. One, we saw the onset of globalization, and as capitalism searches out new cost advantages, as firms attempt to be competitive, as competitive market pressures act on companies and entrepreneurs, the production of lower cost goods, manufacturing goods, shifted. That's an old story. So what were the advanced industrial economies like the United States, Northern Europe, Canada, the advanced economies of Asia left with? Well, there was only one additional factor of production. Now, that factor of production has always been important. But now, as natural resources became less important, as physical labor became less important, that other factor of production became relatively more important. And that factor is a simple one. It's what each and every one of us possesses. It's our human intelligence, our mental labor, the human mind. Now, lots of other people have groped at this, and groped at this in very powerful ways. Over the past 50 years, we saw the theory of the post-industrial economies. Dan Bell wrote eloquently and powerfully on the rise of post-industrial economies. The rise of services, supplanting manufacturing as a key form of employment. The new economy, the internet economy, the technology economy, the information economy, and of course, in the classic and seminal writings of Fritz Malchuk and Peter Drucker, the most powerful theory of all. The rise of a knowledge economy. Well, I looked at all of those theories and found them incredibly beneficial, and only tried to make one small addendum in Rise of the Creative Class, but I think it's an important addendum, and I think you may find it interesting. As as natural resources which were in our physical earth, God-given, if you will, powered economic growth in the past, as physical labor, which Marx said was something every human being shared. That's what made the working class, in his words, a universal class. They all shared intersubjectively physical labor. What is the fundamental factor, much more than our physical labor, that each and every human being shares? Information is something we acquire, technology is something we create, services is something we make, knowledge is something we learn in schools or acquire on the job. Well, I went back and read a little psychology. And if you read psychologists who are concerned with human development, one thing strikes you right away. The thing that every single human being shares, every one of your kids and grandkids, nieces and nephews, every little boy and girl, every person on the face of the earth shares, is our own intrinsic human creativity. That's the real wellspring of economic growth and development. And for the first time, human creativity, which always played in the background as entrepreneurs seized on new means of production, as people developed new ways of farming, as economies and manufacturing took on new forms and we invented assembly lines and scientific management, that human creativity has come front and center. That is what we are dealing with. We have inherited an economy and a set of institutions, management principles, a way of life, which at every level reflects the old industrial order. And that industrial order has been collapsing before our very eyes for the past 50 years. Now, look at what national governments are doing to try to rebuild these economies. Oh, we have to have stimulus programs that build us more shovel-ready projects, more roadways, more highways. We have to support the housing market. I'll get to this in a minute. But the housing, auto, energy complex was the pinnacle, the fundamental driver, the fundamental social and economic and spatial underpinnings of the mass production industrial order that is collapsing all around us. This economic and social transformation to human intelligence, to knowledge and creativity is more dramatic than any economic transformation that ever happened before. Now think about how painful they were. Think about the things William Blake wrote about when he wrote about laboring in the Satanic Mills. Think about the challenge Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto. Think about the fundamental economic crises, 2 world-encompassing depressions, major world wars, and this economic transformation, I would submit, is a more fundamental break with the past than any of those others. Now, where is this conversation going on? In what national capital are people talking about how to build new social, institutional, spatial underpinnings for this new kind of economic order? That's the conversation we need to begin. And hopefully, my work in the Great Reset can help to ignite or catalyze that conversation. Now, I don't want to bore you with too many statistics, but I do want to give you a few which will enable you to understand the magnitude and scope of the transformation we have gone through. In the year 1900, more than 50% of Americans worked on farms. A growing number of us worked in factories. Less than 5% of us worked in the knowledge, professional, and what I call the creative industries. That's science, technology, research, development, entrepreneurship, management, the professions, arts, media, entertainment, and design. By the year 1950, we had become a manufacturing economy. Less than 5% of us now worked in agriculture. More than 50% of us worked in or around the factory, the industrial economy. Less than 10% of us worked in the creative economy. Beginning in the year 1980, our economy begins to undergo this transformation. Between 1980 and today, the US economy generated 20 million jobs in the creative sector of the economy. Science, technology, management, law, healthcare, arts, entertainment, media, and design. Today, more than 1/3 of the workforce is employed in these fields. In some of our biggest cities and metros, it's more than 40%. Less than 10% of Americans work in direct production occupations. 22% of us work in blue-collar work broadly, which includes construction and transportation, moving and logistics. 1% of us work in agriculture. During the course of this economic crisis, the rate of unemployment in manufacturing, in production work hit 14%, in construction hit 20%, and the knowledge and professional and creative jobs, it's yet to hit 5%. Over the course of the next decade, we will generate another 7.5 million jobs in the knowledge, professional, and creative sector of the economy. Those jobs already account for 50% of all wages and salaries paid. These jobs are the driving economic force of our time. And we have to understand their dynamics and how to harness them. They are what has created the wealth and prosperity which has driven our economy. Now, people hear me talk about the creative class, and immediately they generate two kinds of criticism that I think it's important, because we're here today, to address head on. The first criticism I found fairly easy to address. It has come from the socially conservative right. And it hinges on a simple finding that my colleagues and I found almost now a decade ago on the relationship between open-mindedness and social and economic and demographic diversity and places that can harness technological innovation, entrepreneurship, and human creativity. What we found very simply, and there's a fellow named Scott Page who wrote a remarkable book called The Difference, and he documents this in economic theory. What we found is very simple, that creativity defies the social categories we have imposed on ourselves. Creativity doesn't care if you're a boy or a girl. It doesn't know about gender. It doesn't know about race or ethnicity. It doesn't know about sexual orientation. 50% of those high-tech businesses in Silicon Valley were founded by a foreign-born inventor. In fact, in a book I wrote called Flight of the Creative Class, I said this is the true genius of the American economy. It's not a big market or low-cost production or any of this other stuff. It's the fact that the United States always attracted the best and the brightest. And those regions and communities that could do that in the United States and around the world gain economic advantage. Well, when we found, of course, that regions with a higher concentration of employed artists and musicians and designers and entertainers, and we gave it a funny name, just to have fun with some of my academic colleagues, sorry, we called it the Bohemian Factor. And then when we found that places with a larger concentration of gay and lesbian people had higher rates of innovation and higher rates of income, the gay index, well, people went, by the way, I've never had my work challenged on the grounds of correlations being spurious. You should have seen the backlash that came even from the academy. And it's the most careful, my colleagues did the work, who were extremely careful econometricians, but the backlash was astounding. So what did I get? Does Florida really believe that people with, street guitar players and communities with street guitar players and buskers have an advantage in economic growth? Come on. What he's talking about is downtown San Francisco. Silicon Valley is a nerdistan filled with engineers who don't want anything to do with this. Florida has unveiled his gay agenda on society. All of these years he's been hiding behind this fascination with economic growth as he's foisted this gay agenda. Richard Florida is undermining Judeo-Christian family values as we currently know them. Now that was easy to beat back. But then came the criticism from the left. The creative class is elite. This is an elitist construct talking about, and in many ways mirroring the critique from the right, yuppies, sophistos, trendoids, and gays. An economy built on a creative elite. That's all he's doing. He's developing the roadmap from gentrification. Hello? Did they read the first sentence of the book? Every single human being is creative. The key task of our time is to move behind an economic model where the creative talents of 30 or 35% are harnessed and utilized for economic gains, and those very inefficiently. The true challenge of our time is to stoke the creative furnace that lies deep within every single individual. See, I learned that in my previous studies of manufacturing. When I studied manufacturing firms in the United States, in Europe, and Japan. When I went to Japan and studied the Toyota factories, and the Toyota engineers told me in 1983, we're going to win. We're going to beat the West. Why? Because your model of management thinks the only creative people are the CEO, the MBA, and the research scientists. We know better. The real heart of our factory, our real innovation engine, is on the factory floor. It's by harnessing the knowledge and the intelligence and the creativity of the people who work here. And then if you'll just bear with me, the place I really learned this was from my father. My father was born in 1921 in Newark, New Jersey. My dad had to take a job in 1934. He put his books down in the 7th grade. He went to work in a factory in Newark called Victory Optical. My dad worked in that factory until Pearl Harbor was attacked. He put his tools down on his workbench, and he went and enlisted in the Army. Stormed the beaches at Normandy, came back. After the war, guess what? Took a job, went back to his job in that very same factory. Of course, he found my mom. They got married. I grew up totally Sopranos. We don't have to go into that, but trust me, I still have the accent to prove it. I grew up totally Sopranos in New Jersey. They gave their boys the names Richard and Robert, great Italian names. They wouldn't speak Italian in the home. They wanted us to assimilate. We got scholarships to Rutgers College. Our life trajectory changed. But I really wanted to see where my dad worked. And I would beg him to take me to that factory. And of course, he said, Richard, I work in the factory so that you can have an education. He put me in Catholic school, Sisters of St. Joseph. I have the scars on my hands to prove it, trust me. I will show them to you. He said, I work in this factory so you boys can get an education. That's the way up in America. But I was a pain in the neck. And we didn't have take your son and daughter to school day, work day. My dad was smart. He said, on Saturday when the factory's running overtime, you can come with me. I went to that factory in the down neck ironbound section of Newark, this giant brick factory, and my eyes were agog. I watched the machines whirring, making eyeglass frames. And as I watched the machines, my dad told me this, I was 10 or 11. I've heard this from every CEO I've gotten to spend time with since. He said, Richard, it's not the machines that make the factory great. It's not this technology that's key to understanding this place. You see the German machine toolists, you see the Italian men and women working here, you see the Puerto Rican and Latino people. It's the knowledge and the intelligence and the creativity of the people who work in this factory that create our livelihoods. That's the key. And that's what my work is about. How do we unlock, and in crises, that's the time the positions of companies, as Joseph Schumpeter told us with his theory of creative destruction, of cities and regions and nations change, and those who can dig the deepest and harness the creativity, not just of a creative elite, but can build broader creativity, and that's my first principle of the reset. My first principle, and I just wrote about this, fortunately the FT published it yesterday. 35% of us, 33 to 35% of us work in the creative sector, 10% of us in direct production, 20% in blue-collar jobs, 45% of our workforce works in the service economy. They're the people who take care of our parents, the people who take care of our kids, the people who take care of our houses, the people who take care of us at this resort, the people who give us a haircut, give us a manicure, give us a massage, the people who sell us our clothes. Those are the port of entry jobs that are equivalent to my father's job in the factory floor. We spent the better part of 2 decades making those jobs innovative, adding continuous improvement and quality management. The next frontier, the last frontier of inefficiency in our economy is the service economy. It has to be the #1 national and global priority for job creation. We have 60 million Americans who work in these jobs at low wages with no job security. My father told me a simple story. He said, Rich, when I took my job in 1934, it took 9 of us to make 1 family wage, 9 people. My grandfather, my grandmother worked in a bakery, my father and his 6 siblings, 9 people to make 1 family wage. He said, I came back from the war and I had a good job with a high salary. I could buy a house and put you boys through college. We forget. We think factory jobs were always good jobs. We think they were born that way. God gave us these jobs. Do you know what it took to make those jobs? I don't need to give you a lesson in labor history. It took nearly 70 years of the most vicious struggles this country has ever seen. And then far-sighted business leadership. Far-sighted business leadership and far-sighted economic thinking that said, you know what? If we're going to grow an industrial economy, if we're going to build an industrial economy, we have to create demand. And where is demand going to come from? The small group of people at the top can't create that demand. There's only so many yachts and Gatsby-like estates we can build. Only so many high-end automobiles that people can buy. We have to create mass consumer demand. We have to lift up the bottom. If we lift up the bottom, that creates the demand to grow the economy. And that's what they did. They began to see workers not only as a liability, but as an asset, first in consumption, and then with the revolution in the 80s and continuous improvement, as an asset in production. 45% of our workforce, the last frontier of efficiency. Well, I could talk all day about the rise of the creative economy and how that happened and what we need to do to support it. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about just one other factor. You see, when you hear the rise of a knowledge and technology-driven economy, internet economy, information age, a technology-driven world, the first thing that people conclude is that, oh, that means geography isn't important anymore. With all this technology and wireless and iPhones and BlackBerries and mobile devices, I taught at Carnegie Mellon for 20 years. Our motto was anytime, any place, anywhere. The death of distance. Geography doesn't matter. Everybody, right, you saw the ads, everybody was going to sit by that hillside with their mobile device, typing in and telecommuting from wherever they want. The world is flat. In a flat world, 6 billion people can plug in and communicate and commute from wherever they are. You no longer have to emigrate to innovate. Community is fraying. Towns are falling apart. There's a massive exurban migration. Not so fast. For every force, there's a counterforce. Everything in society. So as there were certain tendencies in our economy that enabled low wage, low skill, low cost activities from certain kinds of manufacturing to call center work, to move away, there was another, and I would submit, much more powerful counterforce. Why can't people see it? Why don't we have a conversation about it? Why is that conversation only emerging now? The much more important counterforce was the role of inward movement, the role of geographic concentration and agglomeration. I submit to you, and I'd like you to reflect on this, that place and community, that geographic place, has become the central social and economic organizing mechanism of our time. That our geographic place, our communities, our cities, our metropolitan areas, our mega regions have replaced the industrial corporation as the key mechanism of organizing our economic and social life, of matching people to jobs. My dad had one job for life, from age 13 to age 65. The average American changes jobs once every 3 years. The average American under age 30 changes jobs once a year. How do we match people to work? We match people to work in a thick labor market in a city. Place has become the key social and economic organizing unit, and the person who figured this out a long, long time ago was Jane Jacobs. I had the opportunity to meet Jane several times before she died, and we spent a long time talking about her contribution. Most people remember her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, her invective against Robert Moses, top-down urban planning, and the destruction of great urban neighborhoods. I feel that book. My father's house was knocked down in Newark, New Jersey, to make room for a highway. When I asked Jane what she thought her most important contribution, she said, "Richard, I think I figured something out that no one else thought about." This woman with not even a college degree, never mind a PhD, would never accept an honorary degree from a university. She said, Adam Smith had a really great theory. He called it the division of labor and efficiency. And with that theory, he said, in his pin factory, his famous pin factory, you could go on and make stuff more efficiently and drive costs down and more effectively and drive productivity out in a company. She said, that's a great theory of making things cheaper. She said, but the theory we really need is a theory of where new things come from. That doesn't come from a company. That comes from a city. A city is the place you can mix and match people, where talented and ambitious people come, not necessarily with college degrees. Many of our entrepreneurs are college dropouts. They come to a city to find others, even unwittingly, and lever their talents, create leverage all around themselves. That's what Silicon Valley is. That's what New York City is. That's what Nashville is for music. As that great economic theorist Jack White of the White Stripes said, when asked what makes a great music scene, he said, that's easy, in a most fundamental Jane Jacobs insight. He said, what happens in a great music scene is a bunch of musicians located in a community, and they're competing like crazy against one another. They are competing for a new sound and a new look and a new fashion and a new image, and they're constantly combining and recombining themselves, mixing and matching and forming new bands, and then one of them takes off. It's the same thing that happens in Silicon Valley. Cities are incubators of innovation. They create a spatial division of labor. Diverse, open-minded cities are our key economic drivers. I summarize this in the book as the 3 T's: technology, talent, and tolerance. You need to have a technology leadership and great universities and great adoption of technology. You need to be a talent creator, a talent attractor, and a talent magnet. In Pittsburgh, when I lived there, I often said the greatest export of Pittsburgh wasn't steel, but the talented, creative people it sent elsewhere. But to be a talent magnet and a technology creator, you have to be a tolerant and open-minded and diverse place. You know, I have a student. She just finished her PhD. She finally figured this out. A tolerant and open-minded place where you can be yourself, where you can express yourself, which has an active sports and recreation scene, an active music scene, where people have a free-flowing lifestyle. That's not just about having good restaurants and good shopping and having fun. That's creating the key signals that it's a place that you can plug into and make your career. And when she looked at the psychological data, she proved that in surveys of over 30 and 40,000 people. Places, and I've learned this the hard way as a dyed-in-the-wool urbanist, in our surveys with the Gallup organization, what we found is that a key element in the success of a place, in addition to its urban amenities and street-level culture and music scenes and art scenes, which are all important and all critically important and not frivolous. People rank those things, not just rich people, low-income people rank those things as important as good schools and safe streets. When we did our surveys of New Orleans residents had one of the highest levels of personal satisfaction in the United States. They thought their government was ineffective. They thought their schools stunk. They thought they had to deal with crime and safety issues. They thought their city had a level of artistic and cultural interaction, bars and taverns and music clubs that added tremendous amounts of life satisfaction, and their churches as well. Open-mindedness and diversity, natural beauty, these were all things that were critical to the life satisfaction of people. Now, I just want to take a couple more minutes and then open it for questions to talk about what I think is going to happen next in this great reset. What I think we're up against with all of this backgrounding that you've just heard, the rise of the creative economy, the importance of diversity, and the importance of place and community and city. We have built a powerful economic infrastructure. We have created the potential for productivity increases and technological innovation that people like my parents, my grandparents with no education, could have scantly even dreamed about in futuristic projections. But of course, that's all broken down. We have unemployment rates that's bobbling in the mid 9%. The real unemployment rate is probably 15, 16, 17, 18%. And Dave Bing, the new mayor of Detroit, has said in the inner city of Detroit, he believes the real unemployment rate is 50%. We have unemployment rates of 25% or higher for people who work in construction, 15% or higher for blue-collar people. And it doesn't look like it's getting better. Our housing market is stuck in the mud, no matter how much money we throw at it. The Eurozone is in terrible shape, and anyone who even bothers, who has the stomach to look at our deficit numbers, gets terrified. So what do we need to do? Our quick fixes didn't work. Our attempt to throw money at the problem and stimulate our economy out of it didn't work. Our monetary policy innovations didn't work either. Yes, they have stabilized and caused us to get past the worst, but they have improved the foundation for growth. We're wasting, sorry, Ram, we're wasting the crisis. Now, what do we need to do or think about to get out of this? We need to keep our eye on the ball. We need to build a real social, economic, and geographic underpinning that can move our economy forward. I learned about this in the Great Reset when I did the research. I learned three things that happened during these periods. These aren't just depression periods or recession periods or crisis periods. These are periods when we reset our lives, when financial reality sets in, when millions and millions of people begin to behave differently. The first thing I learned are these are very long-term processes. Anyone who thinks we're out of the woods on this needs to take a long look at the numbers. It took 24 years for real estate prices to rebound from their 1929 lows. Remember my dad? My dad was 8 years old in 1929 when the stock market crashed. You know how old my dad was when he bought his first suburban house in North Arlington, New Jersey, and began to participate in the great American dream? He was 40. He was 40 years old before, and we went through a depression. Not only government spending, a New Deal, World War II mobilization, and then another decade before the economy emerged on this great path. Looking back in historical memory, we shrink time. Same thing happened in the 1870s. It took 3 decades to reset the economy. Second thing I learned is that government spending is an important enabler, but it can't solve the problem. And the third thing I learned is that individual technological innovations, these are the most individually technologically innovative periods. The 1870s and 80s and 1930s were the 2 most innovative decades. They blow away the 1990s in terms of innovation. But it's not just individual innovations, it's new systems of innovation, like Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse's system of electric power, like our system of street railways and cable cars and subways, like public sanitation, like our system of roadways and traffic that allowed and new housing systems. We have to build whole systems of innovation. And then I learned something even more fundamental. What powers economic recovery over and above all of those is something no one ever talks about except a small clique of geographers. They call it the spatial fix. The spatial fix. It's not the technological fix that powers our way out of recession and depression. What they argue, it's the spatial fix. I'll make this real simple. It wasn't just New Deal spending that helped us get out of the depression. It wasn't just World War II mobilization that helped us recover from the economic crisis. There was something that was more important than any of them: the rise of suburbia. The suburban way of life. When my dad sat in front of that house and said, "Rich, we live on what I thought was a farm. This was a farm when I was a boy, and I couldn't even get here because nobody had a car. We live on a farm." That's the nature of the shift. The suburban way of life, the combination of houses and roads, spurred the demand for all of those products of the assembly line. It worked perfectly for the old order. It doesn't work perfectly anymore. We need a dramatic break with the housing, energy, auto complex. Why? Not because sprawl is a bad thing, not because suburban houses are silly or tacky or people don't like them. That's all nonsense. Because if we're going to open up spending and create demand for the new industries that are going to power our future, if we're going to invest in new technology-based industries and new energy and personal and human development, skill development, where's that money going to come from? Why did Americans go into so much debt in the first place? We were massively over-consuming the fundamental goods of the old order: housing and energy and cars. The average American spends over 55% of their income on housing, cars, and energy. Add in education and health care, food, and what's left over. Herbert Hoover had a great phrase. You might not like Herbert Hoover. A chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Before a car could go into every garage, agriculture had to become effective, efficient, and cheap. Before we can build an economy of the future on creativity and knowledge and productivity, we got to make housing and energy and cars cheap. And what the book, The Great Reset, talks about is how that is happening now. How we can already see the beginnings of that trend as empty nesters abandon their McMansions and move back to smaller units, as young people postpone buying a house, as our cultural fetish for cars begins to diminish. Everyone from Nate Silver to many others are showing the decline in cars at a status symbol, as millions upon millions of Americans slowly but surely begin to reset the way we live. We're going to build a new way, a new spatial unit. Cities were the thing that powered the first economic revolution. Cities and suburbs and suburbanization powered post-war growth. We are generating massive new mega regions. It's not city versus suburb anymore. That's a mistaken debate. It's city and suburb. The intensification and increased density and concentration. Look at the greater Washington, D.C. area. It's, of course, the rebuilding of the district, but Bethesda and Arlington, the remaking of Tyson's Corner as a more walkable, human. 60% of Americans say they want to live in a walkable neighborhood. These massive mega regions, like the New York, Boston, Washington corridor, the Denver, Boulder area, Northern California, Southern California, where I live, the area that goes from Toronto to Buffalo to Rochester. 40 of these mega regions worldwide house less than 18% of our people. They produce 2/3 of our output and 9 in 10 of our innovations. We're going to have to make them bigger and stronger and more economically integrated. We're going to need better forms of transportation. High-speed rail is one, and we can talk about it. we're going to have to tilt the balance away from home ownership. And it's something I've been writing a great deal about. Home ownership was the fundamental economic driver of post-war prosperity. It was the major economic and social and geographic underpinning. It no longer powers growth. It puts people in the poorhouse. It distorts our economy. It deflects resources where they can be better used. We found in our research that already 36 million Americans rent, and more are doing so every day. In the most flexible and vibrant and innovative communities across this country, our high point in home ownership was 70%. It's falling drastically as a result of the crisis. It's now down to about 66%. The Urban Land Institute predicts it'll be 62%, but in the most innovative communities in our country, whether that's Silicon Valley or LA and entertainment or New York, 50 to 55% of people own their homes. We have to tilt back home ownership from where it was. And in the less innovative, the stodgiest, the most economically depressed communities, 80% of people own their homes. We need to invest in an infrastructure of the future, not an infrastructure of the past. Every Great Reset has seen the way we house Americans and organize our cities shift. We need to build an economy and a set of economic underpinnings. We need to take a set of public investments and invest them in the future. Well, as a professor, you know I come from the Fidel Castro School of Public Speaking, so I could talk about this all day. But I promise to leave you some time for questions, so with that I'll end, and please fire away. There's microphones here near the front. Thank you, guys. Who wants to be first? I see all kinds of hands, so I'm going to depend on the microphone. I'm from the city of Portland, Oregon. Turn
on the mic. There we go. Perfect. I'm from Portland, Oregon, which I think you would agree, we have the gay index, the creative index, the green, the bikes, and the light rail. What we also have, to challenge one point that you made, is probably the most organized urban planning top-down in the world. We have a green growth boundary, urban growth boundary, it's promoted density and so forth. So I would argue that in our city, the urban planning that was done at the top has been very successful in promoting the kind of culture and place that you talk about. Would you like to argue that?
Rules matter. I mean, Paul Romer has it very exquisitely and elegantly showed us that rules matter. And I think neither I, and I don't want to speak for Jane Jacobs would say that rules don't matter. It's just aggressive, heavy-handed government clearance and heavy-handed government interference. I do think the one challenge for Portland, a city that I admire and actually scores higher on all of our indexes, when I looked at Portland very closely, it scored very high on beautification, territorial assets, tolerance, and talent. It could boost a little bit its technology side of the equation. It's the only thing that's really held it a little bit back. Investment in universities, knowledge-creating institutions. But I think it's an example for everyone in the audience of a community without those. It's the only community, in fact, in the United States without a fundamental, super research-driving set of institutions like the Valley has in Stanford or Boston or Austin, Texas, or the North Carolina Channel that's been able to become a knowledge-based institution. It's done it a lot on quality of life and smart planning.
Hi, my name is Erin Williams, and I live in St. Louis, Missouri, and South Beach, Florida, which I think are probably as two diverse communities as you could get. And my question is, one of the reasons I'm able to live in two locations is because of the advent of technology and the ability to do my work from wherever I am. So my question is, why do you believe that physical location is so important as technology is developing?
I love this point. Your point is so important. And whenever I go and talk to communities, especially communities like South Beach, where now that we live in Toronto, Ron and I spend a lot of time in South Beach because it's close and it's accessible and it's fun, it's compact, it's walkable. Communities, especially like this one, Aspen or South Beach, have to understand how to integrate multi-locational people. And they have no clue. I gave a talk in Naples, Florida. I named 3 people I knew in Naples, Florida who were at the heads of industry and commerce and arts and culture. No one in Naples, Florida knew who they were. So we're dealing with multi-locational people. Technology gives us that. But the other thing it does is it probably makes your location choice much more important to you. When you can choose, when you don't have to just go where the jobs are, where the ports are, where the resources are, where you have some flexibility in picking location, people get to pick the locations they want to be in, and they not only pick beautiful locations, and this is where everyone gets this confused. They not only pick beautiful and open-minded locations, what people are looking for more and more is locational leverage, locational premiums. They want locations, that's why this festival is so interesting. at so many levels to me. It's a way of creating real locational leverage around ideas. And so when people are picking locations, they're looking for whatever locational leverage they can get out of them. And that's why I wrote Who's Your City? And people need advice on this. People need advice on how to best pick their locations. And furthermore, not only from the community side, locational choices will change over the course of your life cycle. So what fits us as a person when we're young and single right out of college, where I think go to the biggest city you can, optimize your earnings. We already know what the earnings premium in big cities like New York are for college kids. It makes no sense to try to minimize because you take that earnings premium with you. Then when you have kids, you can make another set of location decisions. And when you're an empty nester, still a third set of location decisions. But I think locational flexibility doesn't mean location becomes less important. It actually means that people will become much more selective in picking the locations they do choose to live in. I'm just following the microphones. Please.
Hello, Mark Davis. How do we maintain income levels in a flat world where people who are used to making $80,000 for certain jobs that can be outsourced to the rest of the world can be outsourced to equally qualified people who can deliver that same product at substantially lower prices?
The classic collective action problem. And it's the collective action problem Keynes thought about, Alvin Hansen thought about, and Franklin Roosevelt thought about. The classic collective action problem that's confronted this country time and time and time again. How do we keep incomes up? How do we create demand? And now it's worse. It's not only worse because it's global spreading. That's one aspect which you hit on. We have the highest levels not only of personal, individual income inequality, that's now compounded geographically. I've just looked at the data. When you look at the data separating income levels in the most advanced cities, the most prosperous cities, from those at the bottoms, when you look at levels of skill and education, this country is becoming ripped apart. And then within our most prosperous cities, levels of income inequality we have never seen before. So we not only have a class society, overlaid on top of that now we have an economic geography of class. Guess what that gives us? Red and blue and angry. This isn't about a red and blue political thing. This is a quiet class war. That's what we got on our hands, a quiet class war going on. How do we solve it? I think there's only one way. We've got to push up the bottom. We can't cut off the peaks. We have to push up the bottom. We have to make service jobs good jobs. That's all we got. We have to make low-skilled jobs like my dad did with a 7th grade education. We have to make them good jobs. The only way we're going to make them good jobs is to increase their productivity and innovation. That's why I called on the president and his administration to convene a summit immediately. Immediately, to take those 60 million jobs we have, which are a third of a professional job in wages, a half of a production job, and turn them into good jobs. That's what we did in the New Deal. We had a national effort to make manufacturing jobs good jobs. Those are the jobs that disadvantaged folks do, that racial minorities do, that single-headed family people do, that disabled people do. We have to somehow make them good jobs. 60 million Americans, 45% of our workforce. If we cannot make them good jobs, this just continues. And there's no way we're going to bring the manufacturing work back. There's no way we're going to build an economy around manufacturing. It's like saying we want to bring the farms back. Of course, we're going to upgrade farms. We're going to have more organic farming, more people will be employed. But it's just a drip in the bucket. Tina?
Yeah, my question is, what is a good job? When you say making a good job, what does that mean?
Tina's question was, what is a good job? What makes it a good job? Higher pay, family supporting wage, and a higher level of human involvement and employee engagement. One of the things we found is a key to making, and work I did previously with the Gallup organization, there are companies that are doing this, from Best Buy to the Container Store to Wegmans to Trader Joe's to the great book now on Zappos. The way those jobs become better jobs is to make them more fulfilling, more engaged, and higher paying jobs. What is the benefit to the employer? The more engaged employee dealing with customers. I mean, in a service organization, you're dealing face-to-face with personal contact with customers. If the employee is disengaged or PO'd, if that employee picking up the phone and responding to a customer call doesn't want to help, you've all experienced it, that doesn't help the company's bottom line. So it means building in employee engagement, continuous improvement, and innovation. I do not think any individual can do this. I think the effort is so massive. That's why as a nation, we need a summit. We need to bring the leaders of Zappos and the Container Store and Wegmans, the best service companies together to figure out what works and what does not, and where some small public-private leverage could be used to improve them. But that, I would say, is job one in this country.
Marion Peters, I was wondering if this helps, speaking of St. Louis, Missouri, if this will help the urban blight in a lot of these great cities, manufacturing cities, Dayton, Ohio, these places where there's nothing downtown now.
Isn't this amazing for folks listening in, that in some of our cities we've seen almost complete rebirth, and in other cities the hole in the donut has gotten larger, and Detroit now, the idea is to clear it and farm it. It's just so remarkable to me. But most people look at one or the other, but forget that they're both going on. This is just an indication of the level of spatial and geographic inequality we have. I think with regard to those places, we need to empower communities fast. We know it works. We've seen what's worked in Pittsburgh. We've seen what's worked in other older communities. It means empowering neighborhood and community groups. What worked in Pittsburgh, and I've just been very candid about this, every large-scale government effort to build those stadiums and convention centers drained income out of the town and were imposed by many community groups. It was small-scale community efforts in real neighborhoods supported by a set of philanthropies, the Mellon Foundation, the Heinz Philanthropies, and others, that empowered the community development corporations in this country are so remarkable in what they can do to rebuild neighborhoods. So that's what we need to do. Immigrant groups, foreign-born individuals, disadvantaged groups, provide small-scale resources to those groups to rebuild their neighborhoods. You mentioned South Beach. One of the things that really struck me the other day reading in the Miami Herald. Now, there are rich people in South Beach, and there are a lot of poor people, and there are a lot of people in the service businesses. So every time I go, I look at the empty blackened condos. And I say to myself, why isn't that housing being used? How can that's just gross that housing is there, all unused. The Miami Beach Community Development Corporation has started buying the abandoned condo projects. And what are they turning them into? Affordable rental housing for service workers. That's the kind of stuff we need more of in this country, and even in our older cities where condos were built. Begin turning them to affordable rental, connecting people to work, and acting at the local level rather than the top-down level.
The kinds of things that you've been talking about create not just, as you put it, innovation, but also, in essence, a competitive edge. Now, if you look around the world, who is getting it, what you're saying? Who is getting it perhaps faster than we are getting it?
Well, you know, I'm a pretty good sense of this because I get to travel all around the world. I think every one of you needs to come to Toronto. I think you need to take a look at Toronto. I mean, I thought I knew Toronto. I really did. I thought I knew the city. And until we moved there. I knew like the downtown core and the entertainment district and the university. I didn't realize that there was what I called an urban family land when I had to rewrite Who's Your City. That not just high-income people who can afford private schools, every income group can live in the downtown of Toronto within a mile or 2 miles, and some choose to live further out if they choose to, and send their kids to good schools where there's health care provided so people don't have to sweat about that, where most of the great universities are right part, and technical schools are part of the downtown, where the suburbs are manically and frantically trying to reinvent, where they're trying to attract people who used to come to the United States. Vancouver, Sydney, Melbourne, all of Northern Europe, the great cities of Northern Europe. And then, of course, the emerging cities in China and India for whatever they're doing. I do think the competition is fiercer, and I do believe that that's a good thing. That's going to cause lots of people to wake up and say, well, we have to get with this competition and do better. But the key to success is very simple. Which of those cities and communities will harness the fuller-blown creativity of their population? Just like on the factory floor, the companies that began to harness more and more of worker intelligence and knowledge got a competitive edge. The communities that break with this divide, that can, you know, my new model is those who waste less win. Those who waste the least win, whether it's human resources or environmental resources. So those communities that can do that over time will get that competitive edge. Please.
Bob Buford. The suburban culture is built, it seems to me, on a big box culture. Circuit City and malls and things like that. You mentioned churches, they're enormous. Mega churches. Do you visualize all of that kind of collapsing, or what do you visualize happening to that big box world?
Well, I think there's a great remaking. One of my colleagues, a great urban designer, David Lewis at Carnegie Mellon, told me the greatest urban revitalization program of our time is not the inner city. It's remaking our suburbs. That's where the construction is the shoddiest. That's where the buildings are the least, and the infrastructure is the most weakly built. So I think it's a large renewal project. And what I talk about this in the Great Reset. The programs that really excite me are suburban rebuilding. The rebuilding of Tyson's Corner, the classic edge city, the transformation of Arlington, Virginia, the incredible transformation of the older suburbs around Toronto as they try to attract foreign-born people and create density, walkability, transit hubs. The work in Prince George's County in Maryland by the African-American leadership to remake Prince George's County as a more creative, walkable, pedestrian-friendly. So that's enormous. I do think, though, we can give the big box developers more credit than we think. From Best Buy to Target to even, I would submit, Walmart, they can all begin to understand the need to create a different kind of floor plate. A big box store is really just a set of stores. There's an electronics shop and a digital video and audio shop and a clothing shop and a grocery store. Those things, yes, you get some advantages of laying them out laterally, but those can be laid out laterally in a more urban context. They can take, and that's happening. And some of the most far-sighted urban planners, we did this in Pittsburgh, in the East Liberty neighborhood, some of the most far-sighted urban planners are saying, that's a way we can work together. One of the things we learned in Pittsburgh with our disdain for the big box, right? Because we were the urbanists. We wanted mom and pop shops. We wanted local stores. What did the lower income residents of the neighborhood say? We want jobs and we want cheap stuff. Yeah, you can have all your yuppie goods. You can have your organic whatnot. We want jobs and we want cheap stuff, right? We want what you get. And so we began to develop a plan, and community development leaders began to develop a plan of how to create a more urban version. Now, they weren't able to convince the conventional big box, but they did a remarkable job of convincing Whole Foods. And the Whole Foods store they achieved employing local residents and also providing a wider mix of projects was incredible. Now, that's an enlightened employer, but it can and should be done, and I think that's where urban development and urban planning pressure can be applied to some ends.
My name is Desmond Dugan. I am an Aspen High School graduate. And actually, for those of you who are talking about St. Louis, I'm going to WashU in St. Louis next year.
Congratulations.
Thanks. My question to you is, could you elaborate on what you think makes the creativity sector more stable than the manufacturing sector, and why do you think that that's going to be the future? And yeah, thanks.
Well, I think why it's the future is because it's where jobs are being created and where the application of intelligence can lead to the creation of new things, new ideas, new products, new forms. And I do believe our economy is not just technology driven. Also, a lot more of our consumption is either going to be directly or indirectly experientially driven. And that's why the merger of arts, design, entertainment, and technology is so important, because increasingly the things we buy, if there's going to be a bigger margin, will be not only great technology, but some experiential component. Apple's a perfect example, and there's gazillions of others. So the creativity jobs are growing, and they pay well. I think why there's less unemployment has another factor. People in manufacturing are tied to the job. If they lose that good job they had in an assembly factory, in a steel mill, it's almost like a tenured position. They're not going to be able to translate that skill. First, there's very few of those jobs. But two, even if they couldn't move, they're going to have to start back at the bottom. Where people with the knowledge-driven, creative, higher human capital levels have a much more flexible basket of skills. So just in terms of education levels, unemployment rates for people without a high school degree are 15 to 20%. Unemployment rates for people with some college are 10%. Unemployment rates for people with a college degree are 4.5%. So knowledge and creativity occupations have a more flexible skill set that people can move more flexibly and are more used to moving around in jobs. I think that explains it. Please.
Richard, I was wondering if you could elaborate on what would be your vision for the role that financial institutions should be playing in this reset, particularly those that used to make a lot of their money from mortgages for homeowners.
Well, I think that's another reason to come to visit Canada. I mean, we were blown away as Americans. Like, we had this thing we thought was a fixed rate mortgage, but it's a closed mortgage, which means we can't pay it off early or we have to pay a penalty. We can't just flip and refinance mortgages there. We pay a huge penalty and interest rate. We have a contract with the bank. Banks hold their mortgages. So there are a variety of things we could do right now instead of putting $1 trillion of our money into supporting the flipping and refinancing of mortgages. It's all a government market now. There is no private market. I mean, it's absurd and it's gross. So, and we're going to have to pay it off. I think our financial institutions have to become much more like a utility. I really do. They supply capital. It's a critical function, but it's not where the real economy is. We have to figure out a way institutionally to make our financial markets work effectively, sort of like a utility that can supply capital. And maybe the other place we need to look is at our great venture capitalists that have in the Silicon Valley and elsewhere put capital to work. But I think right now we have to tilt the balance away from financial mega profits and to the real economy. I know we're at time. I just wanted to say one other thing, and I know Sir Ken is talking today, so I want to encourage you guys to go hear him, Sir Ken Robinson. But I want to just say one last thing that we didn't talk about, but it's in the book. If we're going to build a creative economy, there's one last thing we have to do in addition to finance and housing and geography and getting our cities and suburbs better. We got to dramatically change our education system. We have a creativity squelching machine on our hands that's a hand-me-down from the industrial age. Every great reset this country has gone through has completely remade its educational system, and we forget this. And I just want to, before you go hear Ken later, I just want to put this preface in. In the 1870s, we created mass public education that gave people basic reading, writing, and arithmetic who were uneducated before, not only native-born Americans, but immigrants. In the New Deal and post-war era, we massively expanded not only high school education to more people, so the kids coming after my dad went to high school, but we massively, through the GI Bill and state funding of education, created higher education that was accessible to all. Schools are not real estate. And we just have to get over this. It's about learning, not putting kids, and I'm going to say this in the most blatant way, in these prisons. We have to break with this mentality that we have to go and punch a clock to get. How much learning goes on in those places every day? How much learning actually goes on in that classroom? We have to, with the technology we have, with the communities we have, with increased density, we desperately need a massive, and the effort we need today is going to make the invention of public schooling and the invention of the GI Bill look like the most small-scale chicken feed we've ever seen. If I want you guys to remember one thing, is that this is not a typical economic period we're going through. The run-of-the-mill solutions won't work. We do need a much broader set of thinking and a much bigger reset. I just want to thank the organizers for having me and thank all of you for questions, and I'm around to talk more if you want.